We're talking this morning about hope. Titled the message, Reflections on Hope, because that gives me a whole lot of room to go wherever my thoughts happen to take me. We want to think a little bit about what hope is and perhaps give you some new ways of looking at hope that I hope will stick with you and that you'll reflect on in the days to come, and that will be an encouragement to you. One passage in particular, when we think of defining hope, that jumps out is in Romans chapter 8, verses 24 and 25. It says, "But hope that is seen is no hope at all." All right, so we start trying to get our mind around what is hope. And that very first statement reminds us that, okay, there's something about hope that relates to not being able to see something, okay? If you see it, then there's really no hoping. Well, Paul goes on to say that very thing. He says, who hopes for what he already has? It's not rocket science. Make sense? If you want a bicycle, you get the bicycle. You're not hoping for it any longer, right? I've got it. I don't need to hope anymore. Okay? But, Paul writes, if we hope for what we do not yet have, then we can wait for it patiently. Okay, so hope has something to do with something that we don't yet have. I think that's important. It doesn't just say if we hope for what we do not have. It says if we hope for what we do not yet have. Now, what does that suggest in your thinking? That maybe there's a reason to believe it will happen. Something that you are anticipating, and that's what we call having hope. That we can perhaps see a reason, we have some reason to believe that this may yet come, that this may yet happen. Interesting, it's always good to study Scripture in its context, to not just lift out a verse and say, okay, let's take this all by itself. If we look a little more closely at the context of Romans chapter 8, and I like to take the context back to verse 18 at least, in that chapter. The Apostle Paul is setting a context where he's talking about something that's present and something that is yet future. Guess what word he uses to describe what is present? It's the word suffering. He uses a word to describe what's future. And that's the word glory. Now, we often talk about glory as being a place. When we try to really dissect the word and understand what this word glory means in the Bible, boy, the answers are all over the place. And I like to kind of simplify it and say wherever you see the word glory, just think of something that's too good for words. Okay, kind of the opposite of suffering, all right? We get that. So there's this sense of where we are in our circumstance right now might be broadly described as suffering. Where we want to be, where Paul talks about this future, is described as glory, too good for words. So, let me put it in different language. Imagine you're looking at a map. Well, let's say life is really more complicated than a map, isn't it? You agree? More like one of those mazes, on paper where there's all these paths and all these roadblocks and everything, and you look at it and say, I'm not sure there is a way to get from here to here. That more life? Yeah, okay. So you're looking at this maze. It's not just a little puzzle maze. It's a huge, huge maze. And you can see where you are. And you can see where you'd like to be. So where is hope in that picture? I want to suggest that hope involves the existence, or at the very least the possibility, of a path leading from where I am to where I want to be. If there is no path, there is no hope in that context, in that equation. Hope involves the existence, or at least the possibility, of a path from where I am to where I want to be. Now we're going to expand it and understand that there's even a bigger picture involved, but that's where we want to start. I think of some of the prayer requests, concerns that we shared this morning. I think of Esther. We think where she is and just all of the physical issues she's had and all of the suffering she's been through and the times when it seemed like there was no path. And where is it she wants to be? Well, maybe at some point you start saying, I'd really like to be healthy and be as healthy as I was when I was 25 or 30. I mean, Esther was a phys ed teacher. She was active. That was her life. And for how many years has that been taken from her? At some point, maybe the goal of where we'd like to be keeps getting moved because we can't see any pathway to that. And maybe where we want to be is just, I'd like to not hurt anymore. And even then, sometimes we can't see a path from where we are to where we want to be. But you can imagine when then a doctor finally listens and says, I think this is what's going on, and let's try this. And maybe it's happened a dozen times or more. And you open that door to hope, just a crack, right? Because you're not sure if this path gets there. But at least it suddenly looks like maybe there's a possibility. You allow yourself to hope a little bit. And I'm seeing on your faces you're tracking. You're getting it. And we can talk about Brenda, same thing. Just a few days ago, Mike shares with me the emails sometimes between him and Brenda just to be praying for her. And it was just a few days ago. It was probably the most discouraging I've heard her in this long ordeal. And a few days later, still guarded. But here's a plan. Here's what this doctor thinks is going on. And here's a new suggestion of what can maybe help. And yeah, maybe lots of reason to be really guarded, but it's like that door to hope opens just a little bit because at least maybe there's a possibility that my pain can be reduced from what I've been living with. Even Claude. They're in the hospital room with him last Monday, and they just gotten word from one doctor that they didn't think this procedure was really going to be advisable for him, and was recommending not to do this procedure. And I mean, Claude was not, I don't want to say he was in despair, but you could see just the countenance. I mean, Claude's not a man, you know Claude, he's not one who's just way up here when he's happy. I mean, he's kind of like some of the rest of us, his happy and sad go like this, not like this, So you got to look real close to see when, he's happy and when he's sad, but you could still see kind of the weight of realizing what this might mean. That there was no solution being offered for the pain that he's experiencing in his back. Can't see any path between where he is in sometimes number 10 pain and where he'd like to be. And then within a couple of days, another doctor looks at it and says, no, I think we can do this. I think we should do this. And where we are now, and says his pain's come down to 1. And we don't know the future, but you understand. You understand the power of hope, of being able to see a path. Now I want to refine this a little bit because life is not only about getting where we want to be. It's not at all costs. You're saying, well, wait a minute. Well, no, listen. I want to refine this definition and suggest that hope is the belief that there is an acceptable path from where I am to where I want to be. Did you catch that change? Not just a possible path, but one that's acceptable. And you maybe say, well, what do you mean acceptable path? I'll take any path I can get. Well, really? Okay, let's make this really simple. Let's imagine that where you are is I can't pay my bills. Where you'd like to be is I'd like to be able to pay my bills. Okay, that's not real complicated. And I see a path. I hear of a job that's available. It's a fairly low-paying job, and it's 2 hours away. So is that path an acceptable path to get where I want to be? And I start doing the math and find out, well, no, I'm going to spend more money on gas than I'm going to make, and it's really not going to help me get to where I want to be. It's a path. So you say, well, that's not acceptable. Maybe there's another path that's a job that requires heavy lifting, and I've got a bad back. I'm hypothetically, okay? There may be reasons to say, no, that's not an acceptable path. Or maybe there's a third path that involves a mean of obtaining money that's either illegal or immoral. And either I say, no, I'm not willing to take the risk of winding up in jail, so I'm not going to go rob my neighbor in order to pay my bills, just out of self-interest. Or I might say, no, that's not who I want to be. I don't want a path that's going to require me to compromise the character that God's called me to be and to live out. So we're talking about a path that's acceptable. If you think back about the map about actually driving on roads, what road is unacceptable? Well, maybe it's a toll road. It costs too much. And we say, no, I'm not willing to take that route. Or maybe it's the risk. It's a dirt road and it's bumpy and we don't want to throw our alignment out or whatever. And we say, no, that's not an acceptable road. Or the route itself is either too long or it takes me through places where I don't want to go. You understand that not every path is acceptable just because it gets to where I feel like I want to be. Remember the guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Remember a moment in history? Where were they? Before they were in the fire, where were they? Standing in front of the fire, in front of this furnace, right? Told that they were about to be thrown in, okay? So they were in this place of great danger, a place that looked like their lives were coming to an end. And where did they want to be? Well, they wanted to live. Yeah, not in the fire. And there was a path. In fact, it was this huge highway that opened up for them to get from standing in front of the fire to not being in the fire. All they had to do was bow down to the idol. It was a huge path. The king himself guaranteed it. Bow down, no fire. Was it an acceptable path? Not to them. Okay, you had to go complicate things, didn't you? So what if there is no path? Because sometimes there's not. want to suggest a whole nother approach that can also generate hope within us. I want to suggest that we can look at hope in terms of not where we are and where we want to be, but who I am and who I want to be. The belief that there is an acceptable path from who I am and who I want to be. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were they? They were servants of the living God. Who did they want to be? They wanted to be faithful servants who did not betray God, who did not deny him under any cost. And that path was the one that was more important. That goal, that desire was more important than where they wanted to be, was who they wanted to be. And they found that the path leading from who they were to who they wanted to be was one that led straight through the fire. But they were willing to take that. And as we know the story, God honored them, God rescued them. But I believe that even though there was no hope, there was no, in what we've looked at so far, I'll put it that way, there was no reasonable road that had opened up to them to escape the flames. They still found hope because it was based not in what happened to them, it was based not in where they were, it was based in who they were. And they found that door, there was always a path. There's always a path to become who we want to be. And that path was a path of saying no to the king and yes to the flames if it had to be. On perhaps a less serious note, but still very much in keeping with this notion of focusing on who we want to be. Have a friend who often, in maybe sending an email, has this little tag. You know, sometimes in your emails you can have a signature and you can add, your address automatically. You can add a little statement, some slogan or whatever, and just every time you go to sign an email, you just hit a button and it puts all of that there, okay? Part of the slogan he adds that I've seen several times is this very simple statement. Whenever I feel sad, I decide to be awesome instead. Think about that for a moment. Whenever I feel sad, I decide to be awesome instead. Now, feeling sad is often attached to where we are, right? I mean, there are other reasons. I realize this is not going to fit every situation, but in general, our sadness tends to come from circumstances and from not being where we would really like to be. And this friend, he could probably list a number of things about his life right now that aren't what he would like them to be. But the wisdom of saying, okay, when I feel that sadness, and there are things, maybe I can't see a path to where I'd like to be, but I can focus on who I want to be in the middle of wherever I am. And it's not bragging, it's saying I decide to be awesome instead. I'm looking for something I can do to maybe contribute to someone else, to be who I want to be, no matter what my circumstances are. You understand how that can be another source of hope in our lives. But there are two other sources for the child of God. I want to suggest that hope can also come from the belief that something greater than what I want, something greater potentially than where I want to be, actually lies at the end of the path I'm currently walking. Now that might be a cumbersome way to talk about this, but when we come back to Romans 8, remember that emphasis on both the present and the future, and the present is characterized by suffering, and the future he calls glory. And the way he actually writes this is, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. And he's talking about a future where things are going to be made right. He's talking about a future that's too good for words. And he goes on to acknowledge in this passage that the world is broken. The world is a mess, and all of creation is groaning, because we're in that time of here's where we are and here's where we want to be, and it's hard to see a path from here to there. And things are not right. Things are not what we want them to be. Later on he says, and it's not just the world, it's even believers. Those of us who are trusting in God, we face the same thing. Our worlds are broken too. Our paths are all messed up, and there's a lot of heartache, a lot of hard times in life. And the Bible acknowledges all of that. But it also calls us to a hope that maybe things are not always as they seem. And just because we can't see a route from where we are to where we'd like to be doesn't mean there's no reason for hope. Because God has promised that there is a future. There is a future which is going to eclipse all the suffering that we might experience in this life. He compares it to childbirth. And this is not new to you. When he talks about all of creation in Romans 8, groaning as in the pains of childbirth, from the very beginning right up until the present time. That's the normal in life. From what I hear, labor can feel like it's going on forever. The sufferings of this life can feel like they're going on forever. And sometimes, for some people, I can't tell you why, they do seem to extend pretty much from the cradle to the grave. There are people who seem like they've had nothing but suffering their whole life, or most of their life, and I can't explain that. There are really good people who experience that. There are really godly people who experience that, and I can't explain why. But I know that even in those cases, God offers us a hope. To believe that even if we can't see a path to where we'd like to be, that at the end of whatever path we may be walking, through whatever degree of suffering we may have to go through, that there is a future at the end of that path for those who trust in him. A future that he says is not worth comparing. A future that he says is at least a little bit like going through labor and then experiencing the joy of a newborn baby come into the world. That's the hope that he offers us. Talking about some of the people in our congregation and what they've gone through this past week. Jeannie Alderfer's, by comparison, has maybe not been as severe as some of the others. Certainly not. But anytime you go into surgery, and there's always the question about, okay, they're going to get a closer look at what's going on in there, and maybe they're going to find something scary. And chatting with Jeannie, she was filled with hope. Not because she absolutely knew 100% the outcome of this surgery. Not because there was a guarantee that there would not be anything scary found in this surgery. But because she knew what I just talked about. She said, sure, I'd love to watch my grandkids grow up, and I'd love to stick around for a while. But even if, what's the worst that can happen? Even if. Because I get to see Jesus. And Brooke. Now, she's not packing her bags to go anytime soon. But you understand the presence of hope that's not even dependent on our circumstances. A hope that goes beyond the limits of this life. And I want to suggest it's not even just, and even saying that, it sounds silly. It's not even just the promise of heaven. It's even here and now. It's not just what God has promised, but it's a hope rooted in who He is. The belief that an unseen, gracious hand is present and guiding in the midst of all the chaos of my life. And that I can actually trust in Him, whatever happens in my life. That's hope rooted in the person of who God is. That's hope that echoes the song that Sherry played earlier. I think it was our prelude. Do you remember what that was? It's like, oh, there have been too many songs. You do remember. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. Started so simply. Why do I feel discouraged? I don't even know all the words by heart, but yeah, you know the song. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. And there's a hope there. There's a hope in who God is, that even when we can't understand, even when it looks like on the maze, every path has a roadblock, we can still have a hope that's rooted in Him. The psalm that we read together is our call to worship. It says, my soul waits for the Lord, more than the watchman waits for the morning. More than the watchman waits for the morning. A couple fascinating things about that psalm that we don't have time to go all into this morning. One of them you might notice, well, it says Lord all the time. There's Lord in capital letters, and then there's Lord in lowercase letters. And what's going on with that? Well, just this simple thing. Understand that Lord in capital letters is God's name. That's any time in the Old Testament, in the New Testament too, I think, when in most translations where you see Lord in capital letters, it's that, we call it Yahweh or Jehovah. It's that name by which God revealed Himself to His people in the Old Testament. That means I am who I am. It's considered the most personal, holy name by which God is known. That represents who He is, separate from any other God, any other Lord there is in the universe. That's uniquely the God of the Scriptures. The lowercase Lord means the one we've acknowledged as our master. Fascinating combination in that psalm. You know, it takes both to have the peace. Acknowledging who He is and having that personal relationship with Him where we say, not only are you Yahweh, not only are you Jehovah, not only are you Lord, capital letters, but I trust you as my Lord. I hope in you as my Lord. And He uses both of those all the way through there. He says, I wait on the Lord. That word waiting doesn't just mean passing time patiently. It means trusting. It means holding on to while we pass the time. I wait on the Lord more than the watchman waits for the morning. Have you ever known a morning not to come? Have you ever experienced a night that wasn't followed by a morning? Yeah, me neither. I'm sure the night watches can get long. And I'm sure there's times when it might feel like morning's never going to come, but the watchmen have hope because they've never known a morning not to come. They're hoping. They haven't seen it yet this time, but they're pretty sure, aren't they? They have really good reason to have hope that it will eventually come. Now, that's about as sure a thing as you can get in this life, isn't it? David says, my hope is in the Lord. I wait for the Lord more than the watchman waiting for the morning. God is even a more sure thing than morning following the night. Let's hope in him. Let's trust in him.